Do you have a child who struggles in the areas of nonverbal learning and social emotional learning? Wow, they might have a nonverbal learning disability. Hi, I'm Dr. Roseann, and today we're talking about how nonverbal learning disability, how does it impact learning and social emotional functioning? And of course, what can parents do to support their kids with nonverbal LD? So let's talk about what nonverbal LD is. So, first of all, it's a neurological condition where somebody has difficulty learning in the nonverbal areas, and that would be motor skills, visual spatial skills, social emotional learning. And these are kids that and adults that typically have great verbal skills and can be deficit in visual processing, visual motor, as we said, but often math as well. And I like to think of NVLD as the cousin to autism. And, under this neurodivergent umbrella, there are a lot of things that impact social functioning. But like autism, NVLD and those with autism, they really lack the understanding, the perspective of the other person. And that's really the biggest difference between other conditions that have social issues. So, for example, it's not uncommon for somebody with ADHD to struggle socially. It's also not uncommon for them to have great social skills. But why would somebody with ADHD struggle? My experience has been the impulsivity and that they get the back and forth, right? There's a reciprocal communication skills. They're able to talk about other people's interests, unlike those with NVLD and autism. Their interests, their communication is much more one-sided. It's about what they like. They might be very interested in social skills, which is socializing with others. They maybe have great surface skills, which are like hi, how are you? I think people are really confused by that, but they really lack that depth, right? So they only want to talk about real life stories, right? They only want to talk about Thomas the Train or my interview the other day with Hannah, we were talking about her son could only talk about Harley Quinn. And the moment you talked about something else, it's like their face just turned off. There just was no interest. And that's not fun to talk to somebody who's like, just there. But with people with ADHD or kids with ADHD, that's so different because they want to, but they're just impulsive, right? So when you really get into the nitty gritty, they can really have a back and forth conversation. It's just that at different times they can't because of the impulsivity. So, what do we do, right? Of course, there's a huge impact with those with NVLD, autism, any of these neurodivergent conditions, right? We need socialization. We don't need a lot of different friends. We just need like one, two friends, right? We need that practice in relationships. Those friendships become the basis of work relationships, love relationships. And it's important for kids to have social skills. And some kids, my kids spend a lot of time around adults. They're great with kids, but like, as long as we're getting a socialization, we just can't always let our kids dictate the conversation if they're really weak, right? You have to stretch them. You have to have these conversations. And those people who have kids who, nonverbal LD, autism, whatever's going on, you get it. You understand, right? You can't always talk about Thomas, and we have to actively practice it. So let's talk about, how do we diagnose? How do we assess? So nonverbal LD is diagnosed with individually administered tests. It's a battery of cognitive as well as academic tests, right? And neuropsych tests, because we want to test those motor skills. We want to test visual spatial. We want to look at math. We want to measure the verbal skills. When I used to do neuropsych, psychoed testing back in the day, I would sit down and do a battery of tests. And usually my nonverbal LD, I wasn't sure. People would come in and we weren't sure if they had ADHD. We weren't sure if it was a learning disability in math or autism. Like sometimes they would all be there, but I would hear and say all 3 of those have to be assessed, right? Because most of the time there was weak math, and it is part of that diagnosis, but there has to be a real discrepancy between the visual and the verbal skills, and then there has to be an academic impact. Sometimes I would have kids with profound visual spatial skills, and depending on the area of math, certainly some of my kids could do great with statistics, but things like geometry or those kinds of basis, right? Which early on you're testing those things. It was like a foreign language. I also find that my NVLD kids tend to have low motivation. And I think there's some real crossover with NVLD and actually pathological demand avoidance. Behaviorally, there can be quite a disinterest, a lack of motivation, a lot of anxiety driving the resistance to these behaviors. Go back and listen to those episodes. So, what are some strategies that you can do, right, when you have somebody with an NVLD? So, you've gotten assessed, you can go to your school because this impacts learning, get an assessment, you get a private evaluation. Not a ton of people who have a lot of experience in NVLD. I think it's about 1.7% of identified kids. So it's a much smaller percentage. I mean, certainly much less than autism. But, you know, go to good old Google, ask for a reference. There's I live in a small state and there's only a few people who really do it. So really try to find somebody who can guide you. Again, when it comes to the therapeutic component, the cousin of this is autism. So if you're looking for therapies, finding somebody who works with autistics is really going to help you because they get that rigidity, they get the social components, right? But these individuals really have a lot of verbal skills. So that's another reason why they compensate. So when we're looking to support learning, right, we want to think what's the deficit, right? So we want to provide visual aids. We want to give step by step instructions. Now, somebody with NVLD can really, their learning profile is verbal. So is it step by step with a picture and a word? Is it, broken down orally, right? We want to give them hands on practice for activities that require any kind of motor coordination. And this crosses over, this is learning in all areas, it's not just academic. We always want to review, right? Repetition and review, repetition and review. I mean, you can't do that enough with our neurodivergent. We want to look at what tech tools are available. I'm just astounded how many cool apps there are today for learning and, taking notes on slides and this and that. There's just ongoing. So, ask your learning specialist at school, Google it, find different ways to support your kid and walk them through the use of it, right? We always think our kids are more tech savvy than we are. I mean, Dr. Rowe, I'm like a superstar in tech. I'm like an 8.5 out of 10. And it's because I just am like, I love that stuff. I'm always looking for ways to do things easier and better and make things be more attractive. And so tech tools are like right there. And so, help your child. These are kids that often are deficit in organizational skills because of the visual skills. So if you're sitting there and trying to color code things and whatnot, that might not be for this person. It might have to have a big old word on top of everything. So work with your kid and say, does this feel right? Try it, try it for a week, try it for 2 weeks, and then switch and try something else and do a comparison. That's really helpful. When it comes to social emotional, we want to really help our kids explicitly understand social rules. So just like kids on the spectrum, there's so much inferential components that go on that we're not just stating things. So anything that's a gray area, you have to make it explicit. So, how do you do that, right? So, regardless of your kid's age, social stories, when they're younger, they can be, actual drawing social stories. As you get older, you can do oral stories, just like switch the gender. People with social skills deficits that are weak, they sort of never connect it, right? So really give examples where there was a problem, how it was fixed, that solution and the positive outcome. And you then should be role playing with kids with NVLD, anybody with these difficulties. And you really should be doing this as a parent if you need more support, things like social skills groups. Don't just rely on the social skills groups of school. Sometimes they're abysmal, like, oh, we're playing Uno. That's not gonna move the dial, people. You need a curriculum. Find somebody locally, get the therapy for it, and, you wanna always do lots of positive reinforcement. Look for moments of teaching empathy, teaching reflection, better understanding, and find ways that you can role model, siblings can role model, maybe even have a peer mentor, particularly because their verbal skills are so good that they could be a great outcome of in a situation with a peer mentor. Different schools have peer mentors. Ask your schools, is there a peer mentor for my kid with social difficulties? And most importantly, we always want our kids to have coping skills. When you have a dysregulated nervous system, you know that you can't think, you can't learn, the body can't heal, you're not gonna be able to take action. So when we find ways to tolerate stress, we are much more able to access our thinking brain, our executive functioning skills. We're not going to be as heated and reactive. We're also not going to show those understimulated behaviors either as much, inattentiveness, poor listening, low motivation. And so by teaching coping skills, those are the tools, those are the tricks that our kids will be able to use today and in the future. And that's where your role modeling comes in. But the level of reinforcement that your child is going to need, because social skills are so gray, is much more than you think. Remember, it's at least 3 times the amount that you think. So we're talking at least 100 times in order for your child, teenager, whatever, young adult, to really get these skills. It's never too late. However, the longer you wait, the more your kid feels shameful and bad about themselves. And when shame is here with kids, you get angry behaviors, you get resistant behaviors. You really start thinking that your kid is doing this, willfully. That's just a coping mechanism. And so we have to have healthy coping skills, and your child has that ability. If you are looking for more support, you can go to our solution matcher, drroseann.com/help. Fill it out. It's going to guide you and match you to what you need. And you get on our email list and you get these, beautifully crafted emails that give you lots of resources. It's really a rough road when your child is lacking social skills because we don't emphasize them enough. We don't reinforce them enough. And schools have a lot on their plate. And, just because kids are next to each other doesn't mean that your child is absorbing when they have a nonverbal learning disability. It means that they're not learning there in the same way, but it doesn't mean they can't learn. So I hope today you were inspired to implement some of these strategies, talk to school, and maybe even get your kid identified.